Sorry, we ended up having to end my lecture part 1 a little bit quickly, as I'm only allowed 15 minutes on this current resource that I'm using to record some audio lectures, and they're just a little bit more user-friendly than the Kaltura that CU Boulder uses, but have some limitations as well. So just wanted to make sure that everyone felt comfortable with the findings of that in terms of counting morphemes. So dog is a single morpheme. Shoes, S on the end of shoes, counts as a morpheme. I played, I play, ED. She is jumping, that's 4 morphemes. So when we have a contracted auxiliary verb like we do in she's jumping, we also count that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the ER at the end of faster, you'll see when we do some language sample analysis that oftentimes for young children we don't count some of that derivational morphology, but we'll get to that at a later time frame. So just wanted to make sure that everyone was consistent with their own findings about what counted as morphemes. So let's talk a little bit about syntax now. When we're talking about syntax, we're talking about the rules for word order and sentence organization. And we know that all sentences across the world universally have a verb phrase and a noun phrase. So you have to have a subject and you have to have a verb. But there are rules within given languages for the order of how those things go together in terms of subject, object, verb. So in English, it's a subject, verb, object, word order. She poked him. I love bacon. All would be examples of subject, verb to object in terms of their word order. And we know that languages are categorized into some of these syntactic categories. And when we start talking about theories of language acquisition in our next conversation together, we'll talk a little bit about some of that belief system about what children are born with in terms of underlying syntactic knowledge that's universal to all languages, and, other theorists that feel like it's all learned. So for this little task, again, why don't you take a look at this and determine which of the following are true sentences. Okay, so if you're going to just take a moment, you can stop it here and click it. Okay, but I'm going to go on and give you the answer. And as you can see, you're probably very well able to decide which is or is not a true sentence with that. And so if I go back to that, I can is a sentence. The big, beautiful bird with fantastic wings is not. A small man with a gigantic nose, curly hair down to his knees, and piercing blue eyes is not, because they lack that verb phrase in there. Come over later works as a sentence. She said, no, I want to go. And so from a conceptual standpoint, we can sort of figure that out without really thinking that hard about it, because even without being able to parse or being able to state why something is a sentence and something is not, you're sort of intuitively able to do that as an adult language user. And those skills come from the underlying knowledge of how words and phrases go together and what is needed to actually feel comfortable that it's a true sentence. What we see for children in terms of their syntactic development, that there is an increase in their length of utterance. And we'll talk in our preschool chapter about mean length of utterance, which is one of the ways we look at language samples, and a really both common and well-researched and reputable way of looking at increases in syntax for children. But we see an increase in length of utterance, and then we also see changes in their sentence modalities over time. So we know that children will learn in their early years declarative sentences, I like bread, words that have different forms of negation, like no, not, can't, don't, won't, interrogative sentence forms, and that's where we change the place of the noun and the verb to ask a question. Instead of he is going, is he going, as well as WH questions. And then we also see changes in syntax moving from simple to more complex sentences. And again, we'll explore that further into our preschool and school-age language. When we talk about semantics, we're talking about another component of language, and this is really the governing meaning, rules governing the meaning of words and word combinations. And semantic development is really how children are learning and storing words and word meanings. Your text and most research talks about this vocabulary as a lexicon or mental dictionary, and it's really something that's built over time. with really substantial growth in the first few years of life. And we know that as we get older and later stages of life, we really increase our vocabulary primarily through reading once we become school age. And your notes talk a lot about the degree to which vocabulary grows from, just a word or two at 1 year of age and then exponentially into adulthood. And I think that's just really phenomenal research to know how that growth actually occurs. The estimates are that children have about, just a few words at 1 year of age, moving to, 300 or so by 24 months of age. And then by the time they graduate from high school, your text talks about possibly have acquired about 80,000 words. So we really see just really exponential growth in how children are learning vocabulary. And we know that children learn vocabulary through experiences in their day-to-day life. One idea is that they're connecting all these words to episodic memory. And so basically when episodic memory, we're talking about that in contexts that are repeated and are meaningful to children, they are storing both that memory of what's happening as well as the language that goes with it. So if you think about book reading as a context that may be familiar and experiential, making cookies with mom and dad could be another experience, again, which they're storing both the memory of that experience as well as the words that are being used within it. And we know that initially children's word knowledge is pretty fragile, meaning that, with just some initial exposure, we know that children have sort of we'll call it later when we talk about preschool language, is quick incidental learning, meaning that they have a basic framework. They might know a word, but they might not really have the depth and breadth of knowledge. And so that sometimes we see kids using words incorrectly, both in terms of a lexical concept as well as like a part of speech error, because they don't have all of that information. So it's still a fragile representation. We also know from research that there are some factors that influence how well a child learns a word in terms of their understanding. And one is just the concepts that's represented by the word. So when there's a word that has a clear concept connected with it, it's a little bit more easily learned. And so from that perspective, you have a verb like jump or cook might be more easily learned than a concept like think or know, because clearly they're conceptually represented very differently. The phonological form of the word, most of the time there's no relationship between the phonological form and the actual referent it represents. Once in a while there's an exception, and your text and your notes talk about things like boom and crash. Those are words in which the word itself sort of represents the concept, sort of that noise piece of things. But there are some words that just have sound sequences that are more common within a given language, and those are words that are probably going to be learned more easily than rarer sound sequences in terms of a word representation. And then also something else is the context the word is embedded in. And so for example, when the word is embedded in a linguistic context that provides some meaning, that's a word that's going to be learned more readily than a context which is not so informative. So, for example, if you had a word like the dog, the girl's dog, who was a fluffy, fun pet, that's a context in which there's a lot of information about what that word means just based in the sentence. And those kinds of words will be learned more readily than when that context is not provided. There's some theories about how kids learn words. And the semantic feature theory, your notes talk quite a bit about, and that's that basically children learn features that correspond with a word or a schema. We'll talk about schema a little bit more in our next lecture. But if you think about what would be the semantic features associated with the concept of dog, they would include things like bark, fur, tail, friendly, possibly, and that children will learn these features of a word and relate those features to any word that is similar. So that's why one theory about why early on a child may call a cat, a sheep, and a dog all the same word because there's some features that are similar, maybe the fur, the soft, the tail, and so on. And so that's one of the relevant word learning theories that we'll talk about more again in our preschool chapters. But there's the idea that all of these words that children learn are comprising a semantic network that are interconnected to other words, and interconnected to other words based on their similarity of a concept. So a dog and a pet and a cat may all be interconnected, but they're also represented and connected in other ways too, like words that sound similar, like cat and rat, would be interconnected in this semantic network. And so part of the way that children organize just this abundance of words that they learn, instead of them just being randomly, off in their lexicon and space, that they're building categories and interconnections of words that relate to each other. A word like stove may be related to things like oven and cook, but it also might be related to other things that you find in the kitchen, like pot holder and spatula and so on. And so there's just lots of different ways those semantic networks are comprised. And then over time, children learn more about what a word means. Those words become less fragile, more permanent. They learn that words have multiple meanings, and they learn these words in relationship to the figurative language that they're embedded within as well. Okay, and the last component of language that we're going to talk about is pragmatics. And when we're talking about pragmatics, we're talking about really how we use language in various contexts, and it's really the use. And it includes things like children learning rules of conversation, speech acts, meaning how they're using their language. Are they asking questions? Are they making comments? Things like whether language is literal and non-literal, understanding jokes and teasing, verbal and nonverbal behaviors. And so you can see that understanding of how language is used includes both its use as well as the understanding of its use. And there's a lot of complexity to this component of language, just like the others. It includes speech acts, which we just talked about, which is things like the pragmatic function it serves. Is it labeling, questioning, or commenting? Is the language direct or indirect? And conversational rules, like all conversations have turn taking. We introduce conversations, we maintain them, we change them. If there's a communicative breakdown, meaning we have a problem with something that we've tried to share, a message, we have ways that we repair it. All of these are included in pragmatic knowledge. The other areas that are included in pragmatic knowledges are things like social register, like we communicate differently with an adult or an older adult or a teacher differently than we would communicate with a peer, and children need to learn these social registers. Those fall under that pragmatic knowledge as well. And then also this other area that becomes really important when we talk about toddler into preschool growth is this idea of presuppositional knowledge. And that's really understanding what listeners know about a topic. And we need to know this to use language effectively. If I call a friend and I'm going to tell her that I talked to my sister on the weekend and we're close friends, I might say, hey, I talked to Colleen and she's doing pretty well with everything going on. I don't need to go on and on to tell her that my sister doesn't live with me. She lives in North Carolina and she's just gone through some family things. And so it's important to be able to know how much information you should share or need to share to be able to be on the same page and to have your communication be successful. And that's something that preschool children early on are not very good at in terms of that presuppositional knowledge, but with time they become more effective language users. And then the last little piece that I just wanted to share under this pragmatic register is, this is really old literature, but Grice's maxims provide the foundation for lots of conversations about pragmatic knowledge, because it was one of the early commentators on social language use, and it just has a couple of rules that they feel like should always be in play. That when you're communicating, you need to include an appropriate amount of information, that your information must be truthful, that the information shared must be relevant to the topic at hand, and that the information shared must be clear and understandable. And so this is a really seminal paper that Grice wrote, I think in maybe the 1960s or 70s, that provided an early foundation into this idea of the importance of language and how it's used and what needs to be present for it to be used successfully. That is it for our conversation on the components of language. And if you have any questions, please let me know.